Well, welcome to another edition of Traveling Through History. Really glad you're with us here today. That music you just heard was the Royal American Medley and was played very often by the Revolutionary troops as they battled the English troops that were the strongest military in the entire world. And of course, this upset the Americans pulled off between 1776 and 1781 was truly a miracle on many levels. First of all, most of these individuals grew up thinking they were Englishmen. They were born in the colonies, however, they were truly Englishmen with English rights under the English Constitution. They considered themselves under the king and under the kingdom. They hailed the king at almost every chance they could their entire lives. But as things wore on throughout the colonies in the late 1760s, and as you got into 1770, 1771, things started to wear really thin for the colonists. They started thinking themselves more as Americans than Englishmen, and they started to really be disturbed by some of the treatment they were getting from the king, the taxes that were coming down, the regulations, some of the laws that were being foisted upon them when they felt like they were really unjustified. They felt very much that they were not a full Englishman like the Englishmen who were living in England at the time. And this was certainly felt by and written by all the great writers of the time. One of the great writers we're going to talk about today is Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine, a lot like our episode, if you did see it, about John Dickinson, who was considered the penman of the Revolution. Thomas Paine, of course, there was Hobbes back in England, who was proposing that the kingdom was a good thing. And John Locke, who was opposing Hobbes in his view that there were things called natural rights that we were born with from God and that they couldn't be taken away by any government or any monarch. And so you had all these different ideas swirling at this time. And one of the individuals who was most able to capsulize and put into words how people really were feeling was Thomas Paine. He did so in many different writings and articles throughout the years after he came to the colonies in 1774. At the time he arrived, the revolution skirmishes had already started. The actual war itself had not, but there was lots of different ways that the colonists were starting to get back at the British. And he arrived to kind of a little bit of a hotbed of politics when he got here. And he realized right away that he needed to write about it. And so he started talking to people. He talked to them in bars, and he talked to them in restaurants, and he talked to them at church. And he talked to them on the streets, and he started understanding the way the Americans were feeling. And so he wrote about it. He wrote maybe the two most important pamphlets in the entire lead up to the war and during the war itself. The first one was called Common Sense, which was written in early 1776. This pamphlet, for some reason, in today's terms, we would say went viral. There were hundreds of thousands of copies that were printed up. Initially, it was just 40,000 copies, but then many, many more printings happened. The pamphlet got picked up by all the major newspapers in all of the colonies. It went far and wide to all the governors, all the congressmen, all the individuals who were representing their individual colonies. And it just went like wildfire, all the ideas in it. And the ideas in it were essentially that we deserve a government by the people, for the people. And of course, this idea then got capsulated in the Declaration of Independence and then later the Constitution. So you can see Thomas Jefferson, who we've also done an episode on, and who wrote the Declaration of Independence, was very much influenced by Thomas Paine and by John Dickinson and by Locke and many others who were writing at the time about this new idea, which was that government, instead of being a top-down approach, king telling his subjects what to do, instead needed to be a bottom-up approach. It needed to be a government where the representatives did what the people wanted them to do and were elected to do so. This was really a revolutionary idea and had never been tried before in human history. The one experiment that democracy had taken, of course, was back in ancient Greece, and there was some success with it. But the true by the people, for the people government that the initial Americans came up with, and Thomas Paine being a big part of it, was truly revolutionary. And you can see when we go through the details of what was in Common Sense, you can see why it took hold and why the people were feeling the way they were in the colonies really took hold to what he was writing about and all of his ideas. He then wrote later that year in 1776, when the Declaration of Independence had already been issued, America had declared itself as the United States of America, a new country. He wrote an article that went to the American Continental Troops called American Crisis. This was his second major pamphlet in the series, and this also encouraged the American Continental Troops and also Americans in general across all 13 colonies to rise up, to stand up for their own rights, and to demand a better government, and to demand a government that represented the people and that did the people's business. It was the opposite of what a monarchy would be. So this is the importance of Thomas Paine, and common sense being the shot heard around the world through the pen that it was. I will say that Thomas Paine was different from John Dickinson, who was also the penman of the Revolution, in that John Dickinson was writing about all the grievances that the colonists had, yes. But he was also writing about, let's find a peaceful way to do this with England. Let's not start a war. Let's stay out of a war. We're still Englishmen. Let's demand our rights through our writings and through our political actions, but let's not start a war. So that's what Dickinson was saying. Thomas Paine was very much on the opposite side of that. He felt very much like the rest of the founders, that the conflict was unavoidable and that it had to come, and it was the only way that a perfect union could be formed. There's lots of also discussion about how much Thomas Paine was talking to all the other founders at the time. We know that he had interactions with almost all of them: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, all of them. There is some talk about that he also might have been consulted by Thomas Jefferson when he was writing the Declaration of Independence, and he may have been directly involved in the writing of the Declaration. There's no real hard evidence to that fact, but many historians believe that is the case, and that he brought this common sense idea that he had written about into the assisting Jefferson of the formation of the Declaration. So a really fascinating man, born in England, started his revolutionary ideas there. He had been doing a lot of writings even as a young man. He met Benjamin Franklin while Benjamin Franklin was over in England as an emissary to the colonies. Again, we hadn't declared our independence yet, and so we still considered ourselves Englishmen and Englishwomen. He met Benjamin Franklin, and that was probably the number one turning point in his life, because after that conversations he had had with Benjamin Franklin, he decided to immigrate to the colonies and to come be an American and come be part of the formation of this new country. So really interesting there. We'll get into some of those details. So let's go ahead and talk about the background of Thomas Paine. So Thomas Paine was born February 9th, 1737. He was an English-born American founding father. He was also a French revolutionary, so he ended up going over and helping the French with their revolution after we gained our independence. He was an inventor, and he was a political philosopher. He authored Common Sense in early 1776, as we said before, and American Crisis he started working on in 1776, late in the year. And he actually updated American Crisis with 3 volumes all the way through 1783. And they were 2 of the most influential pamphlets at the start of the American Revolution. And he helped to inspire the colonial era patriots in 1776 to declare independence from Great Britain. His ideas directly reflected Enlightenment era ideals of human rights and natural rights. Paine was born in Thetford, Norfolk, England, and immigrated to British American colonies in 1774 with the help of Benjamin Franklin, arriving just in time to participate in the American Revolution. Virtually every American patriot read his 47-page pamphlet, Common Sense, which catalyzed the call for independence from Great Britain. The American Crisis was a pro-independence pamphlet series. Paine lived in France for most of the 1790s after the American Revolution, becoming deeply involved in French Revolution and French politics. While in England, he wrote Rights of Man in 1791, in part in defense of the French Revolution against its critics, particularly by Anglo-Irish conservative writer Edmund Burke. His authorship of the tract led to a trial and conviction in absentia in England in 1792 for the crime of seditious libel. The British government of William Pitt the Younger was worried by the possibility that the French Revolution might spread to Britain, and had begun suppressing works that espoused radical philosophies very similar to Paine's. Paine's work advocated the right of the people to overthrow their government and was therefore targeted with a writ for his arrest issued in early 1792. Paine fled to France in September, despite not being able to speak French, but he was quickly elected to the French National Convention and used as an advisor. The French regarded him as an ally. Consequently, the Montagnards regarded him as an enemy, especially Marc Alexis Vadier, who was a powerful president of the Committee of General Security in France. In December 1793, Vader arrested Paine and took him to Luxembourg prison in Paris. He completed the first part of the Age of Reason just before he was arrested. Mark Phillip notes that in prison, Paine maintained to produce and to convey a dedication of the Age of Reason and a new edition of the Rights of Man with new preface. James Monroe used his diplomatic connections to get Paine released in November 1794. Paine became notorious because of his pamphlets and attacks on former allies who had felt very betrayed by him. In the Age of Reason and in other writings, he advocated deism, promoted reason and forethought, and argued against religion in general and Christian doctrine in particular being part of government. So he was very much for separation of church and state. In 1796, he published a bitter open letter to George Washington, whom he denounced as an incompetent general and a hypocrite. He published the pamphlet Agrarian Justice in 1797, discussing the origins of property and introducing the concept of a guaranteed minimum income through a one-time inheritance tax on landowners. In 1802, he returned to the U.S. He died on June 8th of 1809. Only 6 people attended his funeral, as he had been ostracized. Paine was born in 1736, the son of Joseph Paine, a tenant farmer and staymaker, and Frances Paine in Thetford, Norfolk, England. Joseph was a Quaker and Frances was an Anglican. Despite claims that Paine changed the spelling of his family name upon his immigration to America in 1774, he was using Paine in 1769 while he still was at Lewes, Sussex. He attended Thetford Grammar School at a time when there was no compulsory education, and at age 13, he was apprenticed to his father's business. Following his apprenticeship at age 19, Paine enlisted and briefly served as a privateer before returning to Britain in 1759. There he became master staymaker, establishing a shop in Sandwich, Kent. On September 27th of 1759, Paine married Mary Lambert. His business collapsed soon after. Mary became pregnant, and therefore they moved to Margate, where she went into early labor. In July 1761, Paine returned to Thetford to work as a supernumerary officer. In December 1762, a year later, he became an excise officer in Grantham. In August 1764, he transferred to Alford, although in Lincolnshire at a salary of £50 per annum. On August 27, 1765, he was dismissed as an excise officer for claiming to have inspected goods he did not inspect. On July 1776, he requested his reinstatement from the Board of Excise, which they granted the next day upon vacancy. While awaiting that, he worked as a staymaker. In 1767, he was appointed to the position of Grampound, Cornwall. Later, he asked to leave his post to await vacancy. He became a school teacher in London. On February 9th, 1768, he was appointed to Lewes in Sussex, a town with a tradition of opposition to the monarchy and pro-Republican sentiments since the revolutionary decades of the 17th century. Here he lived above the 15th century Bull House, the tobacco shop of Samuel Olive and Esther Olive. Paine first became involved in civic matters when he was based in Lewes. He appears in the town book as a member of the Court Leet, the governing body of the town. He was also a member of the parish vestry, an influential local Anglican church group, whose responsibilities for parish business would include collecting taxes and tithes to distribute among the poor. On March 26, 1771, at age 34, Paine married Elizabeth Olive, the daughter of recently deceased landlord, whose business as a grocer and tobacconist he then entered into. From 1772 to 73, Paine joined excise officers asking Parliament for better pay and working conditions, and he published in the summer of 1772 his first pamphlet, The Case of the Officers of Excise, which was a 12-page article, and in his first political work, spending the London writer distributing the 4,000 copies printed to the Parliament and others. In spring 1774, he was again dismissed from the excise service for being absent from his post without permission. The tobacco shop then failed. On April 14th, to avoid debtor's prison, he sold his household possessions to pay his debts. He formally separated from his wife Elizabeth on June 4th of 1774, and he moved into London. In September, mathematician, fellow Royal Society, and Commissioner of the Excise, George Lewis Scott, introduced him to Benjamin Franklin, who was there as a voice for colonial opposition to British colonial rule, especially as it relates to the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. And you can remember in our episode with John Dickinson, he was writing a lot about the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts and what the grievances were there. Benjamin Franklin was the publisher and editor of the largest American newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, and suggested immigration to Philadelphia for Paine. He handed out a letter of recommendation to Paine, who immigrated in October to the American colonies, arriving in Philadelphia on November 30th, 1774, and telling friends at the time that going to America was a real new opportunity for him. Paine barely survived the transatlantic voyage. The ship's water supplies were bad, and typhoid fever killed 5 passengers on this voyage. On arriving in Philadelphia, he was so sick he could not disembark. Benjamin Franklin's physician, there to welcome Paine to America, had him carried off the ship with 3 men. Paine took 6 weeks to recover. He became a citizen of Pennsylvania by taking the oath of allegiance at a very early period. In March 1775, he became editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine, a position he conducted with considerable ability. Before Paine's arrival in America, 16 magazines had been founded in the colonies and ultimately had failed, each of them featuring substantial content and reprints from England. In late 1774, Philadelphia printer Robert Aitken announced his plan to create what he called the American Magazine, with content derived from the colonies and not from England. Paine contributed 2 pieces to the magazine's inaugural issue, which was dated January 1775, and Aitken hired Paine as the magazine's editor 1 month later. Under Paine's leadership, the magazine's readership rapidly expanded, achieving a greater circulation in the colonies than any other American magazine up to that point. While Aitken had conceived of the magazine as non-political, Paine brought a strong political perspective to its content, writing in his first issue that every heart and hand seemed to be engaged in the interesting struggle for American liberty. Paine wrote in the Pennsylvania Magazine that such a publication should become a nursery of genius for the nation that had now outgrown this state of infancy, exercising, educating American minds, and shaping American morality. So you can see he was writing already at this time about revolution, and he was writing about the Americas had really outgrown their parent. They really had become a country that were so successful. The economy was booming. People were growing. Everyone had pieces of land, and that the Americas really didn't need the crown anymore, that they should strike off on their own. On March 8, 1775, the Pennsylvania Magazine published an unsigned abolitionist essay titled African Slavery in America. The essay is often attributed to Paine on the basis of a letter by Benjamin Rush, recalling Paine's claim of authorship to the essay. The essay attacked slavery as an execrable commerce and outrage against humanity and justice. So you can see Paine was very much against the practice of slavery in America. Consciously appealing to a broader and more working class audience, Paine also used the magazine to discuss worker rights to production. This shift in conceptualization of politics has been described as a part of the modernization of political conscience and the mobilization of ever greater sections of society into political life. Paine has a claim to the title of the father of the American Revolution, which rests on his pamphlets, especially Common Sense, which crystallized sentiment for independence in 1776. It was published in Philadelphia on January 10th, 1776, and signed anonymously by an Englishman. It was immediate success, with Paine estimating it sold about 100,000 copies in 3 months to 2 million residents of the 13 colonies. During the course of the American Revolution, one biographer estimated a total of about 500,000 copies had been sold throughout the year in 1776. So you can imagine 500,000 copies of this pamphlet that was signed an Englishman, didn't even have Paine's name on it. However, some historians dispute these numbers. Paine's original title for the pamphlet was Plain Truth, but Paine's friend, pro-independence advocate Benjamin Rush, suggested Common Sense instead. Finding a printer who was daring enough to commit his print shop to printing Common Sense was not easy. At the advice of Rush, Paine commissioned Robert Bell to print his work. The pamphlet came into circulation that month in 76 in January, after the revolution had already started. It was passed around and often read aloud in taverns, contributing significantly to the spreading of the idea of republicanism, bolstering enthusiasm for separation from Britain, and encouraging recruitment for the Continental Army. Paine provided a new and convincing argument for independence by advocating a complete break with history. Common Sense is oriented to the future in a way that compels the reader to make an immediate choice. It offers a solution for Americans disgusted with and alarmed by the threat of tyranny from England. Paine's attack on the monarchy in Common Sense is essentially an attack on George III, whereas colonial resentments were originally directed primarily against the king's ministers and parliament. So this is the first time someone had really been brave enough to not just challenge parliament, but to also challenge the king himself. Paine laid the responsibility firmly at the king's doorstep. Common Sense was the most widely read pamphlet of the American Revolution by far. It was a clarion call for unity against the corrupt British court, so as to realize Americans' provincial role in providing an asylum for liberty. Written in a direct and lively style, it denounced the decaying despotisms of Europe and pilloried hereditary monarchy as an absurdity, at a time when many still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, including John Dickinson, as we saw in that episode. Common Sense demonstrated to many the inevitability of separation and independence. Paine was not on the whole expressing original ideas in Common Sense, but rather employing rhetoric as a means to arouse resentment of the crown. To achieve these ends, he pioneered a style of political writing suited to the democratic society that he envisioned. With Common Sense serving as a primary example, part of Paine's work was to render complex ideas intangible to average readers of the day with clear, concise writing, unlike the formal, learned style favored by many of Paine's contemporaries. Scholars have put forward various explanations to account for its success, including the historic moment, Paine's easy-to-understand style, his democratic ethos, and his use of psychology and ideology for his arguments. Common Sense was immensely popular in disseminating to a wide variety of audience ideas that were already in common use among the elite who comprised Congress and leadership cadre of the emerging nation, who rarely cited Paine's arguments in their public calls for independence. One distinctive idea in Common Sense is Paine's beliefs regarding the peaceful nature of republics. His views here were an early and strong conception of what scholars will come to call democratic peace theory. Loyalists vigorously attacked Common Sense. One attack, titled Plain Truth in 1776, by Marylander James Chalmers, said Paine was a political quack and warned that without monarchy, the government would degenerate into democracy. So he was warning against what the colonists actually wanted, which was democracy. Even some American revolutionaries objected to Common Sense. Late in life, John Adams called it a crapulous mess, but did have some good ideas. Adams disagreed with the type of radical democracy promoted by Paine at the time and published Thoughts on Government in 1776 to advocate a more conservative approach to republicanism. Sophia Rosenfeld argues that Paine was highly innovative in his use of commonplace notion of common sense. He synthesized various philosophical and political uses of the term in a way that permanently impacted American political thought. He used two ideas from Scottish common sense realism: that ordinary people can indeed make sound judgments on major political issues, and that there exists a body of popular wisdom that is readily apparent to anyone. Paine also used a notion of common sense favored by philosophies in the Continental Enlightenment period. They held that common sense could refute the claims of traditional institutions. Thus, Paine used common sense as a weapon to delegitimize the monarchy and overturn prevailing conventional wisdom. Rosenfield concludes that the phenomenal appeal of his pamphlet resulted from his synthesis of popular and elite elements of the independence movement. While there's no historical record of Paine's involvement in drafting the Declaration of Independence with Thomas Jefferson, some scholars of early American history have suspected that he was involved indeed. As noted by the Thomas Paine National Historical Association, multiple authors have hypothesized and written on the subject, including Moody in 1872, van der Meide in 1911, Lewis in 1947, and more recently, Smith and Rickards in 2007. In 2018, the Thomas Paine National Historical Association introduced an early draft of the Declaration that contained evidence of Paine's involvement based on the inscription of TP on the back of the document. During the early deliberations of the committee of 5 members known as Congress to draft the Declaration of Independence, John Adams made a hastily written manuscript copy of the original draft of the Declaration of Independence on June 24, 1776, known as the Sherman copy. Adams made this copy shortly before preparing another neater, fair copy that is held in the Adams Family Papers collection in Massachusetts. The Sherman copy of the Declaration of Independence is one of several working drafts of the Declaration made for Roger Sherman's review and approval before the Committee of 5. The Sherman copy of the Declaration of Independence contains an inscription on the back of the document that states, "A beginning, perhaps, original with Jefferson, copied from original with TP's permission." According to Thomas Paine's National Historical Society, the individual referenced as TP in the inscription appears to be Thomas Paine. So if this really is true, and these two different copies of the original drafts of the Declaration were referring to Thomas Paine, then he certainly was involved and was one of the individuals that was trying to be part of this process and approve it. So in terms of his next great work that he did, in late 1776, Thomas Paine published the American Crisis pamphlet series to inspire Americans in their battles against the British Army. He juxtaposed the conflict, the good American devoted to civic virtue and the selfish provincial man dedicated to maintaining British rule. To inspire his soldiers, General George Washington had the American Crisis pamphlet read aloud to them. It begins in the American Crisis. "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from service of their country, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and the thanks of the man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too is cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives us everything of value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated." So you can see that was the opening of the American Crisis pamphlet. And as it says here, George Washington had that read aloud to his troops to inspire them. In 1777, the next year, Paine became secretary of the Congressional Committee on Foreign Affairs for the new American Congress. The following year, he alluded to secret negotiations that were underway with France in his pamphlets. His enemies denounced his indiscretions. There was scandal together with Paine's conflict with Robert Morris and Silas Deane, and it led to Paine's expulsion from the committee in 1779. So for about 2 years, he was on the committee, and then he got expelled by Morris and Deane. However, in 1781, he accompanied John Laurens on its mission to France. Eventually, after much pleading from Paine, New York State recognized his political services by presenting him with an estate at New Rochelle, New York, and Paine received money from Pennsylvania and from Congress at Washington's suggestion. During the Revolutionary War, Paine served as an aide-de-camp to the important General Nathanael Greene, who actually prosecuted the Southern campaign during the war. It's really interesting that Thomas Paine was there with Nathanael Greene and his troops. Paine accompanied Colonel John Lawrence to France and is credited with initiating the mission. It landed in France in March 1781 and returned to America in August with 2.5 million livres in silver, which was the French denomination. It was part of a present of 6 million and a loan of 10 million to the American colonies that were forming as a country. The meetings with the French king were most likely conducted in the company and under the influence of Benjamin Franklin. Upon returning to the United States with this highly welcome cargo, Paine and probably Colonel Lawrence positively objected that General Washington should propose that Congress remunerate him for his services for fear of setting a bad precedent in an improper mode. Paine made influential acquaintances in Paris and helped organize the Bank of North America to raise money for the supply to the army. In 1785, he was given $3,000 by the U.S. Congress in recognition of his service to the nation. So back in London, by 1787, many years later, Paine would become engrossed in the French Revolution, and it began 2 years after that, and decided to travel to France in 1790. Meanwhile, conservative intellectual Edmund Burke launched a counter-revolutionary blast against the French Revolution, entitled The Reflections on the Revolution in France, which strongly appealed to the landed class and sold 30,000 copies. Paine set out to refute it in his publication, The Rights of Man, in 1791. He wrote it not as a quick pamphlet, but as a long, abstract political tract of 90,000 words, which tore apart monarchies and traditional social institutions. On January 31st, 1791, he gave the manuscript to publisher Joseph Johnson. A visit by government agents dissuaded Johnson, so Paine gave the book to publisher J.S. Jordan and then went to Paris. He charged 3 good friends, William Godwin, Thomas Brand Hollis, and Thomas Holcraft, with handling the publication details while he was gone. The book appeared on March 13, 1791, and sold nearly 1 million copies. It was eagerly read by reformers, Protestant dissenters, Democrats, London craftsmen, and the skilled factory hands of the new industrial North. Undeterred by the government campaign to discredit him, Paine issued his Rights of Man, Part 2, combining the principle and practice in 1792, detailing a representative government with enumerated social programs to remedy the numbing poverty of commoners through progressive tax measures. Paine went much further than such contemporaries as James Barg and Robert Potter, radically reducing in price to ensure unprecedented circulation. It was sensational in its impact and gave birth to reform societies all over the known world. An indictment for seditious libel followed for both publisher and author, while government agents followed Paine and instigated mobs, hate meetings, and burnings in effigy of Paine. A fierce pamphlet war also resulted, in which Paine was defended and assailed in dozens of works. The authorities aimed with ultimate success to force Paine out of Great Britain. He was then tried in absentia and found guilty, but he was beyond the reach of British law. The French translations of Rights of Man Part 2 were published in April 1792. The translator eliminated the dedication to Lafayette, as he believed Paine thought too highly of Lafayette, who was seen as a royal sympathizer sometimes. In summer of 1792, he answered the sedition and libel charges thus: if to expose the fraud and imposition of monarchy, to promote universal peace, civilization, and commerce, and to break the chains of political superstition and raise degraded man to his proper rank, if these things be libelous, to the name of libeler be engraved on my tomb. So you can see he was very defiant in the face of these charges coming from England. And of course, England was very worried that he was going to do what he had done in America, which was to stoke up revolutionary fever, and also what he was doing in France at the time, which was to stoke up the same fever for the French Revolution as well. So his last major work was called The Age of Reason. This came out in 1793. He wrote this book right before he went to prison for some time for his libelous charge. And then he also improved the book with another chapter while he was in jail. The Age of Reason was released in November 1794, and largely because of the work of the new American ambassador to France at the time, that was James Monroe, who successfully argued the case for Paine's U.S. citizenship and for the publication of his last work. Paine was only one of 3 deputies to expose the adoption of the new 1795 Constitution because it eliminated universal suffrage, which had been proclaimed, at least for men, by Montagnard. In addition to receiving British patent for a single-span iron bridge, Paine developed a smokeless candle and worked with inventor John Fitch in developing steam engines. So he had a period there after all the revolutions were done where he actually was an inventor. And he worked with several different inventors in their labs and came up with some really great inventions. In terms of later years, Paine remained in France until 1802, returning to the United States only at President Jefferson's invitation. Paine also paid for the passage for Bonneville's wife, Marguerite Blazier, and the couple's 3 sons, Benjamin, Louis, and Thomas Bonneville, to whom Paine was godfather. Paine returned to the U.S. in the early stages of the Second Great Awakening, and at a time when the great political partisanship had begun. The Age of Reason gave ample excuse for the religiously devout to dislike him, while the Federalists attacked him for his ideas of government stated in common sense, for his association with the French Revolution, and for his friendship with President Jefferson. Also, still fresh in the minds of the public was his letter to Washington, published 6 years before his return. This was compounded when his right to vote was denied in New Rochelle, New York, on the grounds that the Governor Morris did not recognize him as an American and Washington had not aided him. On the morning of June 8, 1809, Paine died at age 72 in New York City. Although the original building that he died in no longer exists, the present building has a plaque noting that Paine died at this location. After his death, Paine's body was brought to New Rochelle. His remains were buried under a walnut tree on his farm. In 1819, English agrarian radical journalist William Cabot, who in 1793 had published a hostile continuation, published The Life of Thomas Paine, a really great tribute to Thomas Paine and his life and all the things that he accomplished. Biographer Eric Funner identifies the utopian thread in Paine's thought and writings. Through his new language, he communicated a new version, a utopian image of egalitarian Republican society that had never been considered before. Paine's utopian combined civic republicanism, belief in the inevitability of scientific and social progress, and commitment to free markets and liberty generally were groundbreaking. The multiple sources of Paine's political theory all pointed to a society based on common good and individualism. Paine expressed a redemptive futurism, writing that his generation would appear to the future as the atom of a new world. Paine exemplified British utopianism. Later, his encounters with indigenous peoples of the Americas made a deep impression. The ability of the Iroquois to live in harmony with nature while achieving a democratic decision-making process helped him refine his thinking on how to organize society. So you can see he really was a very impactful person in our history. He was a founding father. He was there for all the very important events that happened from 1774 all the way up through the independence of the country, at which point he turned his attention to helping France with their independence. His writings were so impactful and went so viral at the time that he was one of the most famous people in the country at the time. In some places, he was more famous than George Washington, and really was, in a lot of ways, along with John Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson and others, these were the penmen of the Revolution. So let's go ahead and take a look at a short video, and we will come back and talk about it on the other side.
These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Today we'll be looking at the rise of Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was an American journalist who authored two of the most influential pamphlets in colonial history. We will see how he came to fame and the ideas that he embedded into his works. I'm Christian Murray, and this is the Founders Club. Before Thomas Paine was the man we all heard about, he lived in England, where he was trying to find his purpose. He served as an apprentice to his Quaker father, then sailed the seas as a young privateer, and finally returned to England, where he established his own store. While running the store, he married Mary Lambert, but tragedy would strike when she became pregnant and went into labor early. Thomas Paine would lose his wife Mary, their baby, and then soon after, his store. In the next few years, he would once again work random jobs, some political, and married Elizabeth Olive. Some of these jobs wouldn't last due to his either not showing up or just not doing what he was supposed to do. And like these jobs, his marriage with Elizabeth wouldn't last. After the divorce, he moved to London, where he contrived to meet Dr. Benjamin Franklin. With the guidance and help from Dr. Franklin, Thomas Paine chose to sail to the American colonies in 1774, seeing that there was nothing left for him in Britain. Paine barely arrived in one piece. He had fallen ill on the voyage, and it took him 6 weeks to recover. In March of 1775, he became a citizen of Pennsylvania and was appointed the editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine and wrote in the American Magazine. In these papers, Paine brought a new political perspective by writing about the evils of slavery, workers' rights, and the ideas of American liberty. These papers became popular due to Paine's pen and leadership of the magazine, turning it in a new political direction. Around this time, the American colonies started to rebel against Britain, and the First Continental Congress was meeting to discuss reconciliation with the mother country. They just wanted their rights back from Britain that they felt entitled to as Englishmen. No one argued for full-blown independence. Just under a year later, in 1776, and with a push from Benjamin Rush, Thomas Paine would begin writing something that would change people's perspectives on the future continent. He would write Common Sense, and then The American Crisis. In Common Sense, Paine argues for American independence. He was one of the first to do so, and because of its treasonous nature, he wrote it anonymously. The pamphlet was written in simple, passionate language, and it applied to the common colonial man, a collection of complex philosophical ideas that was only discussed for years by the elites. Common Sense is broken up into 4 sections. The first section is of the origin and design of government in general, with concise remarks on the English Constitution. To begin, Paine works in the theoretical realm, as he discusses the difference between society and government. He writes, "Society is produced by our wants, and government by our wickedness. The former provides our happiness positively by uniting our affections, the latter negatively by restraining our vices." This section heavily relies on John Locke's ideas on government, saying that the government's sole purpose is to protect life, liberty, and property. Paine then adds that we should only judge a government by how well it does just that. He moves on to a thought experiment, telling the reader to imagine people cut off from the rest of the world, as if in a state of nature. These people would eventually form a society, and because issues would inevitably arise, they would have to form a government to deal with those issues. Paine then relies on Montesquieu's ideas by saying that people would be much happier if they are responsible for the creation of laws that rule them. In other words, people would be happier having a democratic or representative form of government. In the rest of the first section, Paine attacks the British form of government because it is riddled with contradictions, has no checks and balances, and has granted their king too much power. Paine would notice how much the Americans disliked the British government, but were oddly loyal to Britain. He writes, "This arises, as much or more, from national pride than reason." The second section is titled Of Monarchy and Hereditary Succession. Paine uses John Locke's argument on how we are equal in a state of nature and writes that the distinction between king and subject is unnatural. He shows that the practice of monarchy originates from sin. To back up this claim, he uses pages and pages of the Bible, along with English monarchical history, to show God's condemnation of kings and how his people always suffer under one. He writes, "In short, monarchy and succession have laid, not this or that kingdom only, but the world in blood and ashes. 'Tis a form of government which the word of God bears testimony against, and blood will attend it." This isn't just an attack on King George III, but on all monarchies. The third section is titled Thoughts on the Present State of American Affairs. By the time that Paine introduces this section, he has trained the reader to not trust the British government and to want to do something about it. He begins the third section by saying, "In the following pages, I offer nothing more than simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense." He states that America has outgrown Britain, and separation is not only achievable, but inevitable. He goes on to say that this is the time to separate because the Americans are more than capable of taking care of themselves. Things will only get worse if independence happens in the future because America is, and will be more so, too large and complex to be governed by Britain. And finally, Britain is not protecting, but attacking America. He ends by detailing a proper government for America that would unite the colonies. The fourth and final section is titled Of the Present Ability of America, with some miscellaneous reflections. In this section, he asserts that America has the ability not only to break free from Britain, but also become a strong nation rivaling any country that would dare try to swoop them up and dominate them independently. He once again stresses that independence will eventually happen and that the continent will feel itself like a man who continues putting off some unpleasant business from day to day, yet knows it must be done, hates to set about it, wishes it over, and is continually haunted with the thoughts of its necessity. In summary, his main arguments in common sense were, first, monarchy goes against God's will, and that we should have a representative form of government that serves the people. Second, it is unnatural that a larger country is ruled by a smaller island that is an ocean away. Third, America has a unique opportunity to be the beacon of freedom and to create a new nation that would remake the world over again. Fourth, England is stunting the colony's growth for its own gain, and America could be so much more on its own. And fifth, conciliation has not worked in the past, and independence is inevitable. Common Sense was an instant hit, and it changed the national discourse from gaining back English rights to being a totally independent American country. Even though it was highly controversial in the colonies, it would pave the way for Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, and it set the colonies on a course that they could not turn away from. In time, the Americans would have their victories, along with their defeats. Paine's American Crisis was a series of papers written from 1776 to 1783 to sustain the colonists' motivations. In 1777, the Revolution was on the brink of death. During the horrific winter at Valley Forge, many troop enlistments were almost up, and the British had just invaded Philadelphia, making it where the Continental Congress had to flee, giving all their power to General Washington. The troops barely had anything to eat, and clothing was scarce. The soldiers would leave bloody footprints in the snow due to the lack of something as simple as shoes. To make matters worse, disease was rampant. It's estimated that 2,500 soldiers died of exposure and disease. Washington had to do something to motivate the troops to stay and fight. He had the opening lines of Crisis read to his men. "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." Crisis worked, and it motivated the troops to re-enlist and fight for their country. Crisis contained a lot of the same ideas that Common Sense established. Instead of just focusing on independence, it really demonized Britain and its loyalists here in the colonies, calling them cowards. It then justified the American cause by saying it was supported by God, and then highlighted the bravery of the Continental soldiers. Paine states, tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Paine had successfully sparked the American desire for independence with Common Sense, and he was able to sustain that desire with the American crisis. Paine was revolutionary in a multitude of ways, and he pushed the Americans to be more radical. These pamphlets made him extremely popular, and he was able to mix ideas that only the elites previously enjoyed with the common man with common language. This brings us to today's question. What would motivate you to go through horrendous situations to achieve a purpose? Let us know what you guys think in the comments below.
So a lot of really interesting things coming out of that video. First thing, as you can see, as a young man, he got a kind of a rough start in England. He lost his first wife, he lost his child. He was fired from multiple jobs, in some cases because he wouldn't show up for work or he wasn't doing what they told him to do. So he's a little bit insubordinate as a young man. He had two businesses he started, including a cigar shop. Both of them failed. So he had a lot of failure, but one of the things he found he was good at was he was good at talking to people. He was good at formulating ideas, talking politics, and mostly he was really good at writing. And that was his thing. And so even back then, he was writing pamphlets and constellating lots of thoughts and ideas that in some cases were very revolutionary. The English government, of course, had him on their radar both before and after the American Revolution, but mainly after, because he really was the match that lit the torch in the Americas to start the revolution. Before he came along and before Common Sense, the discussion and debates were about the grievances and that we wanted to get our rights back from England as Englishmen. All of a sudden comes along Thomas Paine and Common Sense, and it completely changed the conversation and the narrative from wanting to be British subjects to now wanting to have our own country, have our own set of rights, have our own constitution and our own government, and be able to forge our own future. And so this really was incredibly consequential in our revolutionary push as a country. And of course, then comes along the American crisis, his second set of pamphlets, where he was sustaining the troops out in the field, and he was helping George Washington and other generals read those documents to their troops to encourage them and to give them hope and to help them keep pushing forward in this very hard struggle against the greatest country in the world at the time. So you can see the Common Sense and American Crisis, the way he was writing, the way he was talking to people. He was being encouraged by others like Benjamin Rush and Thomas Jefferson, other people he was speaking with at the time. He was in the middle of all of the major political conversations in the lead up to the American Revolution. So highly consequential person. Of course, he did have his flaws, as we heard about, if you got on his bad side, similar to what George Washington did, who let him sit in the jail for multiple years and didn't come to his aid. He would strike out against you. And yet people like James Monroe, who are one of his allies and who got him out of jail and used his clout to do so, he would be your best friend in that situation and incredibly loyal. So hopefully you enjoyed that. You learned a lot about Thomas Paine. You learned about these two very consequential sets of pamphlets that he wrote. The first one being Common Sense, the most viral and popular and most important document written before the Declaration of Independence, leading into the Declaration. And this really was able to gel and put together the ideas of the colonists at the time, that instead of trying to salvage our English heritage, it was time to strike out on our own as a country, declare independence and fight for our independence, and come up with a new and better union and form of government. So that was the consequence and importance of Thomas Paine. Hopefully you'll want to dig a little bit more into him and his accomplishments and what he did in his life. And this writer series continues. As you know, we did John Dickinson, we did Thomas Jefferson, now we've done Thomas Paine. Coming, we're going to be doing a whole expose on John Locke and the impact he had on all of these writers we just talked about. Really, John Locke, in a lot of ways, was the foundational writer that all of them leaned on with his concept of natural rights of a citizen-led government, which had never been thought of before. So thank you so much for tuning in today, and please like this video, subscribe to the channel. We have a lot of great content coming your way. We really love bringing these programs to you. Drop us a comment down below on one that you really would love for us to do in the future, and we would love to consider it and put it into the overall schedule and rotation. Hope you guys have a great evening, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.